Good afternoon on what is another surprisingly mild, bright and sunny day. It is Saturday, the 16th of December, and I'm in the reading nook with a nice hot cup of tea. And a box to unbox. Okay, and what I have got in here is Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground, a guide to tabletop role-playing games from D&D to Mothership. This is by Stu Horvath. It is published by the MIT Press. So, and it's part of the Game Studies series, which I believe has given us things like the Gaming Wizards from John Peterson, and also basically his previous book on talking about how when it was that a role-playing game came to be defined exactly as what we know as a role-playing game today, because it took a bit of time. So, Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground, the guide to tabletop role-playing games from D&D to Mothership. When Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson released Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, they created the first role-playing game of all time. Little did they know that a humble box set of 3 little digest-sized booklets would spawn an entire industry practically overnight. In Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground, Stu Horvath explores how the hobby of role-playing games, commonly known as RPGs, blossomed out of an unlikely pop culture phenomenon and into a dominant gaming form by the 2010s. Going far beyond D&D, this heavily illustrated tome covers more than 300 different RPGs that have been published in the last 5 decades. A lot more than that have been published, of course. Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground features, among other things, bunnies, Ghostbusters, soap operas, criminal bears, space monsters, political intrigue, vampires, romance, and of course some Dungeons & Dragons. In a decade-by-decade breakdown, Horvath chronicles how RPGs have evolved in the time between their inception and the present day, offering a deep and gratifying glimpse into a hobby that has been changed the way we think about games we play. There we go. Let's have a look inside. So we have a piece of artwork there. I mean, this essentially is a table. Give the impression of giving a tabletop. A tabletop coffee table book, as it were. And here we have a breakdown of the contents from basically by decade, and the appendices. The games, Stu's Appendix N, Artists of Note, Dungeons, Thoughts on Collecting, RPG Publishers. Here we have the introduction, nice illustration. Basically, it looks to be a Hydra on the table with your figures, dice, and tape, and pencils. So this is going through his personal history. And then we leap into the 1970s. And we do, of course, start off with Dungeons and Dragons, but we acknowledge its precursors in the form of chainmail, the miniatures rules that preceded it, and that essentially kind of Dungeons and Dragons was kind of based on. So going through, and then we've got the mentions of other role-playing games here, so Tunnels and Trolls, Bunnies and Burrows, and even coming up to date with, very rapidly. So we've got Bunnies and Burrows, and then we have a discussion of The Warren, which is a relatively modern role-playing game using Powered by the Apocalypse. We've also got there the first scenario, Palace of the Vampire Queen, which Prissy Intermediate has brought back. Metamorphosis Alpha, first science fiction, and it's actually the first post-apocalyptic role-playing game because it takes place after the events of a post-apocalyptic event aboard a spaceship. and you know, just basically another piece of Doom that struck the warden, which is an nice scenario. First actual proper, I should say, sort of like science fiction role-playing game, Traveller there, and other games from GDW, including On Guard, which is a very playable sort of like, it's a cross between sort of like a play-by-mail game and a role-playing game. Teagle Manor, Judges Guild, early adventures, and we move on to different titles from Judges Guild, and then Fantasy Trip and Melee, all of which has been brought back by Steve Jackson Games now that he has the rights to them. Arduin Chronicles is essentially one of the role-playing games that could be described as a fantasy heartbreaker, an attempt to do a variation of Dungeons & Dragons that satisfied the author and designer, if not necessarily all of the players. Chivalry and Sorcery, and then the Monster Manual, and again this is going through year by year. Monster books, so you've got the Monster Manual there, and all the world's monsters, published by Chaosium. And then that's a book unknown to me, but basically I think they're discussing that as a potential source book for this material, because that was published in 1971 before we had role-playing games. And then we've also got a picture of the Player's Handbook on the other page. 78, Gamma World, the first true post-apocalyptic role-playing game, at least the one set on Earth. And then RuneQuest enters the picture. As does Dragon Pass. Here you've got the box set. And then the first modules from TSR. So the Giants, Drow, and Queen of the Demon Wed Pep series. And more of these are covered as we go along. Bushido, still a well-regarded Japanese set medieval role-playing game. Notable supplements: Cults of Prax for RuneQuest, and then Caverns of Thracia, a role-playing game campaign and dungeon from Judges Guild. We have more titles from RuneQuest, and we've barely touched the end of the 70s. Dungeon Master's Guide, and even the official Advanced Dungeons & Dragons colouring album. And then we move on to a couple of things, so Snakepipe Hollow, and a thing called Corey Games, which I've not heard of. That'll be interesting to write about, or read. And then breakthrough title there, of course, is B2 Keeping the Borderlands, one of the scenarios that has been played by millions of people. And then we break into the 80s. And again with more titles for the Fantasy Trip. And the continuation of the S series with S3 Expedition to Barrier Peaks, Greyhawk, and various iterations of that. And there's a mention of Dallas, one of the very first and official and complete licensed role-playing games, turned out to be a colossal failure, both commercially and critically. It's not a game you really want to play, I don't think. I have looked at it and it's playable, but why would you? Anyway, deities, god and demigods, and then the distillation of the RuneQuest rules into basic role-playing. More continuation of all the world's monsters, and of course Worlds of Wonder, arguably, possibly the first world sort of like multi-genre role-playing game. Call of Cthulhu, absolute classic, and we're barely sort of like a couple of years into the 70s. We've got multiple supplements of Call of Cthulhu over the years. And that's quite, actually looking at sort of like, that's got quite a lengthy history to it. Champions, Justice, Thieves' World, a setting, fantasy setting based upon the Robert Asprin books and the various city books that you basically, that a mixture of various publishers would bring out over the years. And then we have Dungeons and Dragons, basic Dungeons and Dragons, the BX version, my introduction to role-playing, and how much I love that, and I still do. And I think it's absolutely, its iteration with the with Old School Essentials is great. Isle of the Dread as well, great, interesting first wilderness scenario for Dungeons and Dragons. We have Griffin Mountain, basically a far more detailed and developed adventure campaign for RuneQuest. Stormbringer, the first British invasion of Dungeons and Dragons with Fiend Folio, more campaign fodder from Chaosium for RuneQuest, Borderlands. TSR tips its toe into the full science fiction space opera setting with Star Frontiers. And then we have the breakout story of the early 80s, fighting fantasy series developed by Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson with the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And then the new edition of Basic Dungeons and Dragons, the BECME, basic expert companion, master and immortal. Star Trek role-playing game from FASA, still well regarded. And then the highly rated James Bond role-playing game. I really like that. It's one of my favourite role-playing games. Ravenloft, of course, great adventure for Dungeons and Dragons, revisited again and again. And then yet more Ravenloft. It gets quite a lengthy section. Han as a creation of a realistic medieval world, and then an odd or two with Dragon Raid, the Christian role-playing game. Licensed role-playing games, for example, with Conan and Red Sonja, basic licensed scenarios. Branching out a bit, TSR with Marvel superheroes, and then Steve Jackson's games Toon, which is a really fun role-playing game. And then, lovely mention here, Skyrim Sharoon, one of my favourites. I really like. The first Majestic campaign for Call of Cthulhu, Master of Nyarlathotep. Keep going. So, and there's quite a discussion of that because that's gone through many iterations, and basically many editions, and we're up to like the 5th or 6th edition. Middle Earth role-playing game, MERP. And its connection to Rollmaster. And then we have the launch of Dragonlance, the big storyline campaign from TSR, Dungeons and Dragons, and how that would spin out into its own intellectual property. Really kind of one of the first. And then Pendragon, one of the first great storytelling role-playing games. Further expansions for Dungeons and Dragons. Interestingly, a couple of diversions. Dragon War, a bit of an oddity, and then we have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is coming back next year, and it's a sort of like, actually, I personally think it's the best thing that Palladium have ever done, because it's actually it's actually fun, and that kind of makes sense. So, World of Action and Adventure official guide, another oddity. And then licensed property Lankmar, the first visit to Lankmar by Dungeons and Dragons, currently available for Goodman Games, and then Warhammer Fantasy Role, the British role-playing game. Not the first, but arguably one of the greatest. and then the GURPS, the, sort of like the first sort of like from the ground up generic role-playing game. Phoenix Command, a weird fantasy role-play game, sort of half. No, sorry, Phoenix Command is sort of like a combat role-playing game, and that will be spin-off to things like Lawnmower Man and other things and Aliens. Ghostbusters, for sort of like arguably the third greatest. Ghostbusters, okay, basically one of the top three comedy role-playing games, along with Toon and Paranoia. Star Wars, the role-playing game that we'd all been waiting for, appeared in 1987. And again, that's quite a lengthy section. First appearance of Forgotten Realms as a new setting, as opposed to Gygax's at Greyhawk. And then we have Runes of Undermountain and supplements for Dungeons and Dragons. So just going to flip forward. We have appearance of Ars Magica, which genuinely explored magic in a medieval period. Talazenta, which proudly said it was, you know, a fantasy setting without elves. It's not one I've really ever explored, to be honest. Arrival of Cyberpunk, picking up on sort of like one of the primarily literary genres of the 1980s, with the appearance, obviously, of William Gibson's Neuromancer, and then one of the sillier role-playing games of the decade, Bullwinkle and Rocky. Role-playing party game, essentially an utter oddity published by TSR. Infamously, you played it with plastic glove puppets. I don't know who that was ever for. Well, obviously it was for Bullwinkle and Rocky fans, but it's so American. And then the publication of Hero Quest. And we have Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. Including really kind of the first settings for Dungeons and Dragons that came out as a rash of them over the periods of Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, and were kind of failures ultimately. Didn't sell well. They were popular to an extent, but not popular enough. Didn't make the publisher enough money. Prince Valiant, the other great storytelling game from Greg Stafford, really nice Arthurian role-playing game, very simple. And then we have sort of like the antidote to cyberpunk, the fantasy cyberpunk role-playing game set in the very near future, now in the past actually, to Shadowrun. And then we leap into the 1990s. I mean, he's got here 40 years of history, and so we have things like Torg. So I'm just going to flip forward a bit because obviously I can't go through this page by page. Appearance of Riffs, essentially what I call a kitchen sink role-playing game with the taps plumbed in incorrectly and put on backwards, because it's I don't think it's actually playable as written. The arrival of Lovecraft Country for Call of Cthulhu, of course, Vampire the Masquerade, the big role-playing game of the 90s, and its supplements and its sequels. That, and especially with the live version played live, would introduce a wider audience to role-playing, including lots of women. So, oh yeah, Dark Sun, the setting that people want to come back, but he's never coming back. Amber, arguably one of the first diceless role-playing game. You know that well, not. I mean, diceless in that sense. There's no mechanic, because if you look at Prince Valiant, that was diceless because it used coin flips. Another storytelling game of weird conspiracies and weirdness over the edge. Really like that one as well. Earthdawn, which is a really nice fantasy role-playing game. I mean, it could be called its own fantasy heartbreaker, but it's its own system and it stands on its own. And then we have an oddity here. Once upon a time, the card storytelling game of Fairy Tales, designed by James Wallace, Andrew Ralston, and others. And I think not really a role-playing game. But the next one is which is a setting, Planescape, well-regarded role-playing setting, fantastic artwork, fantastic setting. Recently returned to by Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition was The Coast. Aria, infamously sort of like complex and unusable in its world building, and then we go on to a Castle Falkenstein there, sort of mixture of steampunk and fairy. Everway, the sort of like the tarot card-driven role-playing game of sort of like popping between spheres. Deadlands, great combination of genres in Wild West and horror. Fading Suns, Baroque science fiction. It's one I want to look at in due course. And then we have the introduction of Delta Green, which formalised modern role-playing gaming and a Lovecraftian investigative horror in a way that hadn't been before. And we have Inomine, so basically the first wave of, I mean, I think it's been preceded by Nephilim from Chaosium, but Inomine was like the first big French role-playing game to be adapted into English. We have another horror game, Unknown Armies. One I've never really looked at or played, but always wanted to. And then Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, a really fantastic little storytelling game. And this is followed up by Nobilis, also from Hogshead Publishing, which is a grand storytelling game on a grand stage. And it's a beautiful book. No picture of the previous version there, though. And, you know, there's also sort of like Violence, which is the antidote to role-playing games, the antidote to Dungeons and Dragons. It's not a real role-playing game; it's a satire. And then we 2 decades down, we're into, well, not quite 2 decades. 2 decades. Third decade, we are into the 2000s. And of course, we open up with the arrival of Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, a real codification and redesign of the system to make it into, push it towards being a role-playing game. Whilst you had Hero Wars, which was another take upon Glorantha, a more storytelling-orientated system, and that's got quite a lengthy section going through the different supplements for it. Most of which I want to read. We have an epistolary letter-writing horror game, Liber Fundis, Sorcerer, a noted early storytelling role-playing game that was going to come out of the indie scene. Things similarly, Inspectors, and then generic systems like Fate and Savage Worlds. More storytelling games, Dogs in the Vineyard, designed to do specific kind of genres, and then sort of like the first retro clones with Castles and Crusades, part of the, now what we would call part of the old school Renaissance. Blue Rose, which used the True 20 system, now uses Age, and that would sort of like bring love and romance intentionally into the setting. And then we have a section here on retro clones themselves, such as Osric, the old school reference and index compilation, Basic Fantasy, Labyrinth Lord, And many of these are pretty much of a muchness. They're pretty much all of themselves, but they do work. They are playable. They give you that Dungeons and Dragons style gaming without it being Dungeons and Dragons. Trail of Cthulhu, Lovecraftian investigative horror role-playing, more clue-orientated in how you get your clues. By 2009, we come to perhaps the most well-known storytelling game, Fiasco, which essentially does capers and stories that go wrong, and you storytell them. And then the other breakout fantasy role-playing game, The Pretender, to Dungeons and Dragons Throne, Pathfinder. And then we get into the 2010s, which is all going to be very familiar. So yeah, this is a really fantastic long book. You open with Stars Without Number, basically an old school Renaissance style role-playing game, but really taking in a different genre, and comprehensively so. Your private apocalypse world, and just how it's the list of role-playing games using those mechanics is surprising. We have Microscope, a storytelling role-playing game about playing through essentially aeons of time. Standard Core Classics, another sort of like old school style role-playing game, but its own thing. Then we have Idruga, the role-playing game, one I've not come across. I've not seen everything, I will admit. Most of the ones I'm familiar with. Mutant Year Zero, 10 years old next year. That's a really great post-apocalyptic setting. And here it would look at some of the other role-playing games that would use the same Year Zero engine, including Coriolis and Aliens. And then, of course, 2014 is the arrival of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the role-playing game that has dominated the last 10 years, and absolutely has turned role-playing into a cultural phenomenon, and its reach is incredible. Black Hack, another little retro clone, and of course Tales from the Loop, fantastic role-playing game of childhood adventures in a strange techno alternative of the 1980s. Late in the Dark, about thieves and cutthroats in a city, protecting what's there. Bluebeard's Bride, another storytelling game. Hot Spring Island's complete campaign even come with its own supplement, which essentially was a player handout. One big book, and then absolutely adorable fanzines. I actually love the fact that it has been mentioned. And here's the field guide to Hot Spring Islands is there. That's fantastic. And then we have the 1,000 Islands. Really, there's a series of 10 fanzines. They're very, very good. They're usable with any system, but they capture the flavour and feel of Southeast Asia and its legends and its history, and it's fantastic. Very glad they're in here, and they mark really sort of like the infusion and spread of role-playing from other cultures outside of the Western European and American experience, and that's absolutely a good thing. Harlem Unbound, absolutely the best role-playing supplement of 2017, I think. I think, basically exploring a period of history in absolute detail, treating it properly. Didn't get the awards that it deserved, I don't think, but it deserves discussion and mention in here. And we have Honey Heist, basically about stealing honey from bees, and it's really just down to that. And then Troika, we have basically a role-playing game inspired by the Fighting Fantasy series, but on a Baroque, surreal science fiction setting. Dialect, a role-playing game about language. And then we have Mothership. Basically, Mothership essentially is the old school Renaissance kind of movement. Science fiction role-playing, a science fiction role-playing game. Spire, fantastic storytelling within a rebellion in a twisted spire setting. Old school essentials. the iteration of the modern iteration of the BX Dungeons and Dragons, basic Dungeons and Dragons from 1980-81, and then Fungi of the Fire Realm supplements about fungi, and then 1,000 Year Vampires, the breakout journaling storytelling game, and the other breakout OSR adjacent style role-playing game, Merc Bourge. And then we have the Ultraviolet Grasslands, which thankfully I've managed to finally get a hold of. Not this edition, the new edition. That one, and I really want to review that soon. And similarly, Bastaland I really liked, even though it's kind of like 200 pages of character creation. And that's not as bad as it sounds, actually. And then Necrolotus, interesting role-playing game, which I've not heard of or seen. And we've got different kind of more looking towards the fanzines end of things, like Goblinville Gazette and Low Country Crawl. And oh wow, okay, the Insectary. That's fantastic. That's actually a book I worked on, I edited. That's really nice to see that in there. And then A Visitor's Guide to the Rainy City, which is utterly adorable. It's a fantastic little setting, you know, as a city that really brings to life. It's really fantastic. Anyway, so, acknowledgements. You've got a glossary. Appendix, and basically a list of all the games. So I'm not going to show you all of that, don't need to, you've already seen it. The author's appendix, and essentially his reading material, what he was reading as he was growing up and learning to role play. Artists of note. And RPG artists of note. Dungeons, thoughts on collecting, because there are some things in here I don't have. That'll be useful. List of RPG publishers, and then we have bibliographies at the end there. And then we've got the index. So that is Monsters, Aliens and Holes in the Ground, a guide to tabletop role-playing games from D&D to Mothership. That's the latest, essentially from MIT Press. It's the latest of a similar style of books that we've had over the years. This is perhaps one of, I mean, it's definitely up to date in as far as it gets to 2020, 2019, 2020, doesn't get into the 2020s. So in some ways it's already, you know, it captures a certain point and no more. But of course the hobby's always changing, there are always new books coming out. But this is the latest, probably the nicest and most well-produced book I've seen. I think if you are interested in the history of role-playing games, want to learn more about different role-playing games in the past that you don't know, this is probably worth looking at. There are a few obscurities in there, but not too many. And a lot of them are going to be available to you to find and collect. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this unboxing in the Nook. If you have, then please do click on the like button down below. And of course, if you've got any comments or feedback, I do appreciate you taking the time to post those. And of course, if you want to be alerted to get more unboxings in the Nook, where you'll see me out here with a package containing a book or game, which I will unbox and chat about to the best extent of my knowledge for roughly 10 minutes or so, or in this case 35 minutes, all of course accompanied by a nice hot cup of tea. And the truth is, it's no longer hot. For to the extent of my knowledge, for roughly 10 minutes or so, yeah, not 10 minutes, then please do click on the subscribe button down below. Thanks again for watching. Be back again soon with another one. Bye for now.